Thank you very much. I'm going to try and use the microphone. If not, I can throw my voice. It's very democratic. Then you can't shout back at me if I use the microphone. I've got a career that goes back almost 40 years. It's been very much involved in the area of site specificity. That means that one works with the space that one's given. More recently, one has moved away from that, but the context tends to be in the sculptures that I make, responding to sight in some kind of way. So I've brought some examples this afternoon to show you that. The fundamental that I go for is, why make all this stuff? What's it all about? Why do you do it? What I try and do is I try and challenge our preconceptions we have of our world. And the best way of doing that is to take something that we think we know, like oil, and I could get you to think about that in a very different way. And an example of that would be that this first slide, titled 2050, it's been made 12 times around the world. It's waste oil. It's a hazardous waste material. It's not on the sculptor's vocabulary. It's something that sculptors don't normally use. You can be arrested for pouring that down the drain, but here, when the audience go in, they come out shocked, talking about notions of beauty. So I've taken this material that's been through its own transformation, and I've transformed your way of thinking about it. I've transformed your understanding of the room. We have a programme in England called Doctor Who, and in that programme there is this police box, which when the doctor goes inside is twice as big as the exterior size of the box. And that was my first thought. How can I take a gallery, 1987 Max Gallery, how can I make this space much bigger than we understand the architecture to be? So, smoke and mirrors, sleight of hand, call it what you want. You take something, try and make it bigger. You can do something through illusion or reflection. Now, one could have done something with plastic, mirror, etc., but through experimentation, one gets to a stage in the idea where it's possible to make this so that all you're looking at is the room, but you're seeing the room in a very different way. That slide that you just saw is the Royal Scottish Academy. That's the same year as it was made at Max Gallery. So straight after Max Gallery, it was bought by Charles Saatchi, and it went up to an exhibition at the Edinburgh Festival of the Saatchi collection. So suddenly there was two of them, and it's not the same one. People say, how do you store it? You don't, you chuck it away. You make another one. It was breaking all the rules in the middle 80s about sculpture. Nicholas Listen Gallery was working with a group of artists making objects. But what I was doing is I was working with transformation. I was working with the temporary state of sculpture. I was working with things that couldn't go into a crate. It was kind of like challenging the rules of what was the accepted norm of sculpture in the UK. This was the Boundary Road. This is when we put this in 1991. The oil arrived in a great big tanker and was just pumped straight in. It's a tank with a corridor, and the audience individually walk into that corridor and they experience the room like they've not experienced it before. There's a sense of floating when you get out into the middle of that corridor, because below you the whole world has been taken away and it looks like you could fall out through the skylight. But at the same time, you're aware of this kind of heaviness that the oil could suck you in. So some people find it very difficult to get to the end of the corridor. It's a completely psychological experience. The best way to describe what happens is there's a hiccup between the eye and the mind or the brain. If you're sitting in a train, in a carriage, and the train or the carriage next to you moves out of the station, you think you're moving, but then you see the platform is still. It's that kind of hiccup that the mind has. So there's been many incarnations. This is Melbourne in Australia, Canberra in Australia, and you can see here someone of the audience at the end of the corridor looking down into that vertiginous space of the skylight. This was interesting. This was County Hall, 1992. 2002, 2003. Each one is finely tuned. I go in and I design the piece, and then we have teams now building it. It's going next year to Woltersdorf in Germany, and it'll go to Austria. But in this instance, you can see in that room, that wooden panelled room, I've opened the door and the oil floods round into the next room, or appears to. And very, very small things like the clock doesn't work. But the clock, the hands on the clock are set to 20 minutes to 9, which is 10 to 9, which is 20:50 in the 24-hour clock. Little things like that. Some people don't notice it, but they're just ways in which I fine-tune these pieces. This was the second from last incarnation. This is down in the basement, again with the Chelsea space that Saatchi owned. And in each situation, this is the one that opened the other day at the Hayward Gallery, a big exhibition, 20 international artists, titled Space Shifters. And of course, this is incredibly popular. Again, that door has been opened, and you can see there a view out to the window where you can see out and up. And then that person looking down into those skylights, in those pots, or into those hollows, is the blue sky. So you get this really extraordinary experience. This is a maquette. When I came up with the idea, I was on holiday in the Algarve. It was a hot Sunday afternoon, and I suddenly got the idea after a couple of weeks of just trying to think what it was I could do at the Max Gallery. I was so excited, I had to make the piece to see it. I spent a lot of time making models. I moved them around and look at them. I cycled into Portimao, a tiny village in the Algarve, and I went through a dustbin and I found a shoebox. And so this is the shoebox that represents Max Gallery. I had to make it to see it. It's a priceless maquette. It's not for sale. It was the very first recognition of what that idea could be like. And I quite like the idea it was out of a piece of rubbish to make something out of a hazardous waste material. These things are kind of discarded, rejected and unwanted things. My return to the Max Gallery 2 years later was, if I've done this major piece of work to double the space of the gallery, it leaves a terrible ghost behind. So many people remembered the oil. I had to come up with something to better myself, and one is kind of goaded as an artist to go one better all the time. You don't really want to stand still. So in this situation, I spoke with Robin Klasnick, the director, and I said, I'm going to undo the window and bring it into the room. So I'm taking the architecture and enlisting the architecture as part of the sculpture. Commercially, that kind of doesn't make sense. It's very difficult to sell someone else's building. But this time, rather than expand the space that we have in the world, I wanted to shrink the space of the interior and expand the world into the interior. So the window was like an archaeologist unpicking the soil to find something. I unpicked the window, brought it into the room and boxed it back, using the language of windows, like curtain puckering. I used plastic to box back to the outside world. So when you came into the room, a great deal of the interior had disappeared. And that was the view that you couldn't see. This was when I clambered across the factories and photographed. So you can see the extension of that space is allowed to run back beyond the boundary of the architecture. So you get this kind of refractive moment. It's very difficult to understand where the boundary of the architecture begins or stops. And as I say, the language here, the top and bottom of that structure is a copy of the gallery. He had an artificial ceiling with some insulation board, and that was used in the same way as the plastic is used on the sides like curtains or shower material. And this was the final piece of work at the New Max Gallery many years later. Robin Klasnick had a gallery that had two spaces. So in one space, an artist would be showing, and in another space, another artist was working to produce a show that would open once the other one next door had closed. So there was this kind of open, close thing. And the history of this space was quite interesting. It used to build billiard tables. I originally had a different idea to this. We were going to locate a structure, a housing structure, down into the ground or into the floor of the gallery. This is the first time this gallery had been used. I wanted to put something outside the rented area. I wanted to put a sculpture that sat outside of the gallery space in some way. So it meant I could go outside or push it through the wall. But in this choice, I decided to go down into the ground and locate something, so that the audience saw the work, but also saw the full space for the first time. 19 days before the opening, we dug right down, but we hit water, London's water table. And so the hole started to flood. So it was a major problem. Now, there's three things you do when you hit a problem. The one you don't want to do is throw lots of money at it. What we had to do was finally give up with that idea. But in that 19 days, rather than fight the water, I decided that had to be about the piece of work. I had to use the problem. So you can go in with a preconception about something, and you hit a catastrophe, and so one enlists that problem to get out of, or to find a solution. So, using the history of the building, the context of the site, I went and bought a billiard table, and we located that sense of order, that sense of level with the ground into the hole, and we dropped a 28-inch sewer pipe, concrete sewer pipe, down into London's water table to hold back that water. So you get to the edge of the piece of work, and you look down that 4 metres of pipe, and at the bottom is the water that sits under London. And within that pipe, I added 2 little paddles. So randomly, every now and again, you get this splash. So there was this sort of sense of logic and order of the table, working alongside the sense of the subconscious, the murky, the unknown, the thing that's down in the pipe. Now, it's not unusual to put a piece of work in the ground, because if you looked out of the window from the gallery, right opposite were these big, what we call in England, gas holders. When they're full of gas, they're up in the sky. They're as big as this building here. When they're empty, they go back down into the ground. They screw back down. So the sense of architecture going up and down, being underground and being above ground, was a kind of a direct response to what was going on in the gallery. The outside world was feeding this idea in some way. I'd been in Los Angeles, and I had a phone call to go to the west coast of Japan. A friend of mine, Fran Kitagawa, had been invited by the government of the prefecture of Niigata to work on a 10-year program to rejuvenate a region that was dying. This part of Niigata, although hot in the summer, suffers from about 6 months of snow. The elderly remained, but the young people of the population were moving to the cities. And they wanted to find a way to rejuvenate the whole region. And one way of doing it was to invite artists into industry, crafts, and into education to see if they could have an impact. The other part of that was that 30 artists in that first year of 2000 were invited to make art pieces around the region so that it would generate some kind of tourism. Now, this doesn't quite make much sense. If I go to the next slide, I work with I play around quite a bit with architecture. And I'd flown out from Los Angeles to Niigata Prefecture. And I was thinking, I'm not sure what I could do here. I hadn't really worked outside before. I hadn't worked in the landscape. How can I do something about architecture? But it was only on the flight back, when I looked at the curvature of the Earth from the plane, I started to get an idea. Sometimes an idea can take months, and if you overwork it, you've lost it. You have to drop it. I find, personally, you have to drop it. There are those other ideas. They come in a flash. They come in a split second. And I question those ones because I mistrust that speed that you can get an idea. So you take it on a journey through paper and models. But I always come back to the idea, which means it's got substance. And in this situation, I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll build my house in Japan, but it will be at the same angles as my house in London. So working with structural engineers, which I do quite a bit, I got in contact with Price and Myers, and I said, come and measure my house off the North Star, and we'll put it into Japan at the same angles, as if it's been pushed straight the way through. It's not, if that's my house in England, if you build it round there, it's like that. What you do is you take it, you push it through the earth, so it's upside down. So the 5 angles of collimation were measured off the North Star. Then, through the computers, we then designed up a linear drawing of the house. So it's standing tipped over slightly on its mansard roof, and this is the back extension. So all the verticals and horizontals of London have been completely destroyed by bringing it to this location, which is a direct replica of the size of the house. And it stands next to this temple gateway, which is the verticals and horizontals of that part of, obviously, that part of Japan. And I've always had this idea that perhaps one day I should make that temple in London somewhere. At the angles that it stands at, it would be upside down, twisted. Same year, 2000, 25 artists around the UK were invited to make sculptures around the Millennium Dome site, which obviously is where the big O2 tent, should I dare say, exists. And myself and Anthony Gormley decided we didn't want to work within the programmed area for sculpture. Prime reason being is the soil was only 18 inches deep, so to put any footings down for a major work was impossible. You couldn't break that concrete liner because it was actually holding back all the impurities, the cadmiums that were leaching into the river when it was a power station. So Anthony Gormley and I decided to work out on the river, and I decided to take an architectural structure, being a ship. This I found up north. It was for sale for £12,000. I don't know what that is in zloty, but so I got on the phone in a car park and bought it and gave it to a breaker. I said, you can have this ship, but I want a section of it. And this section was designed to go actually on the GMT line at Greenwich. This is the 0 point of longitude, latitude in maritime timing. And this line runs from Greenwich and runs across London and divides east from west. And I wanted to put this slice. I mean, if you can slice a district with a GMT line, you can put something on that. And it became like a moment in the millennium. It was like a soundbite, this idea in film, where they want to talk about the history of a person, but you've got to give your history in 5 minutes. That's a soundbite. It's a moment of something much greater. And this is a moment of something much greater. But what it also was a breakthrough for me, because I started to think less formally about sculpture, and I began to think about the context. What's the history of this site? 1,000 ships in 1936, I think it was, the coronation of King George, 1,000 ships were going in and out of our port in London every week to our Commonwealth with trading, money going out or goods going out, vice versa. Now you won't see a ship on the Thames, not unless you go downriver. So this was, in a sense, a lament to a lost industry. This was like something that was cut and shrunk, and the heart torn from it, basically. And the idea was, it was this lament that should cry itself back into the river. Obviously, if you say this to any organiser of an exhibition, it flags up, worries, because they think rust, dirt, etc. The piece still exists, funny enough. I ran it as an office for about 6 years. Then it became strange. My son ran it as a club. I hadn't realised he was doing it. I had to ban him, but funny enough, he's living on it at the moment. And so this was the inside as the office. So, it was probably the only example ever of a sculpture that became occupied and used as an office by the artist himself. So this sort of gives you some idea what the 4 different levels were like. As I say, that still exists. Obviously, there's a maintenance problem with it. One's got to constantly keep looking after it. So my ideas now are to hand it over to be used as a museum. I know the man who owns the largest collection of steam whistles in the world, and we're hoping to make it a steam whistle museum. Don't ask me why. Again, it's this thing about how do you get ideas? You know, you can be walking along the street, you might see something, you can sit down with a blank sheet of paper and dwell upon it and something starts to emerge. In this instance, what I was trying to do was, how can I put it? You can get very used to being very clever with yourself. You know what to do. You know your kind of party pieces. I mean, I could have carried on making oil. It would have been incredibly boring, but I could have made a lot of money. The idea is to sort of try and get away from the things you know and to try and find new things all the time. This is where my belief is with art. I'm a producer, but I'm not someone who takes one product and that's my signature and I can continue doing that one thing. So I'm trying to find the simplest way to getting back to the most basic principle of creating something, making something. And I was constantly wondering what to do. And then one day, having washed a pair of jeans, I put my hand into my pocket and I pulled out this £5 note when we had paper money. This is plastic money. This is paper money, plastic money now. This is a £5. We've all done it. You've washed it. You take it out and you go, oh shit. And you start unpicking it. And you're not taught how to do that. It's something you start. And then you start to tear it. So you turn it round and you start picking at some other part of the paper until you've got your money back. Great, you know, you've got your £5. And I suddenly realised this was an incredible creative act. Like I say, we're not trained or educated how to do this. We empirically look and search for the edges of things and pull them around. And this was the seed of a new idea for a show at the Wapping Project Space. I bought an aeroplane, an old Cessna, very, very cheaply. It's just the body, it's not got the engine. And I had it crushed in a car park at the University of East London. We built the aeroplane, we took all the paint off it, we polished it, and then we completely crushed it, which was a day's work. It was incredibly difficult to do. And once it was crushed, it was put into the gallery, and we had a private view with this lump hanging on a chain above head height, no one really knowing what it was. And over the period of 3 weeks, I worked with the students from the university. We started to pull it back out. We used 2-ton ratchet straps we hooked onto the walls of the building, and we started pulling. And we also inserted in holes hydraulic pumping gear, and we pushed. So we were pulling and pushing in this hydraulic pump station that fed energy. It basically fed pumped water to the theatres to operate lifts and curtains in the olden days. So the history of that building was influential to the work. And slowly, the aeroplane came back out. It would never fly again. It was completely crumpled. But you could see over 3 weeks what the process was. At this stage, I still had no definite result as to what the final work would be. Is it people coming in and watching? Or would it be that the aeroplane would be left crooked in the space? So what we did when we started pulling it out is we had a camera, 2 cameras actually, up in the ceiling, very early digital age, that were photographing every 5 minutes. And after 3 weeks of the 8-week run, we realised that we had taken the mass of sculpture and compressed it and pulled it out again, but we'd also taken the sense of time, like mass, and we'd compressed that. I managed to get so much footage, sort of individual images of this, out again, that we put the images together and we made a 3-minute movie that was then put on a screen. So the aeroplane was cut from being suspended in the space once it was out. It smashed to the floor like a swatted mosquito. A spent moment, this husk that had given birth to the film. So we got rid of the physical, and we ended up with light and colour and the sense of time through film, which was giving you the history of what had happened there. Hence, the piece is called Butterfly. So it's this metamorphosis from one to the other. That work was very, very successful. I still have it, and I tore it It's been rebuilt now, so this is an example of the piece in a museum up north where we've reinvented the screen. The screen is now part of the aeroplane. I built some sort of airolons that support this lightweight structure which the film plays upon. And even though it's not in the original space where it was made, it still has a reference. This is, on the screen there, you can see how it started. It's this lump that slowly came out over a period of weeks. And that started to interest me about the way sculpture deals very well with mass, but sculpture doesn't deal with time very well, but film does. So I was beginning to make films and sculptures together. The sculptures were in some way influencing the film. In this instance, it's a caravan on a rotisserie, going round and round, and there's a camera in there, and it's just filming the interior. But of course, as it goes round, the plug in the sink jumps up and waves in the air, the cushions are going round, but it's all on one screen. That you don't see it moving on the screen, it's because the camera is moving with it. So you just get this room with this kind of poltergeist in there that's making all these very weird things happen. The fridge door is just doing this, opening and closing. As I say, the plug goes up and comes down. The cushions are rolling around. They're going round like that. So you come in, you see the film, and then you go behind and you see what's making the film. So sculpture and film working together. And there was a whole series of these pieces. This is called Road Movie. This is a Piaggio. This is an exhibition in Italy. And this Piaggio is spinning round. And as it spins round, that little camera is going backwards and forwards. And it's almost like peeling an orange and laying the peel flat on the table. You're actually taking a three-dimensional object and you're putting it onto the screen. You're peeling the lens is watching the material of that Piaggio spin round. So that's the television monitor that's filming that object. Jump back now, that was the film stage. Obviously, some of these things are very difficult to sell. I mean, in a classic example, although it's not the best example, I did sell it. The window piece, when you start to enlist parts of the building as parts of the work, it makes it very difficult, as I said, commercially. So, obviously, not being an object maker as such, I've had to find a way of earning a living. So I've developed an area in my practice which is about big commissions. And there'll be some examples of those. Rather like the sliced ship. You know, it was a commission. It was done for a particular period. And, you know, one earns, as it were, commissioning money from that. In this instance, this is a new piazza in Chelsea. And the location was rather dull, actually. Very uniform, very regimented. I mean, if you think about architecture, it's about regimentation. It's about, you know, that floor propped up and then another floor propped up. It was trying to break away from what the environment around the sculpture should be. So I started looking at these structures that we have in England where people grow fruit and vegetables in wasteland, and they usually build a little hut. And the hut breaks all the rules of architecture. People get doors and they make a roof. Then they get windows and they make a wall. So it's this kind of playing with things we know, but they're not functioning as they should do. So these are an example of 3 huts from an allotment structure, which I went and photographed and drew and measured, and then produced a standing structure with this background of this very ordered kind of architectural principle being demonstrated. This was just another kind of order for architecture, but it's one that tends to be shunned, let's say. And again, another commission. This is a chamfered corner on a building in Holborn. A chamfered corner is where the building comes along, and it doesn't do 90 degrees, it does 45 degrees then round. And they wanted a small sculpture just above head height. It was a competition, and I was awarded it. And what we did is we copied one strip on Sardinia Street, and we copied one strip down on Holborn, on Kingsway, 1.5 metre, I think, each one, right the way up to the top of the building. And we had them made in the factory in 2 long moulds. And then we put them together so they made 90 degrees. And they were to fit on the end of the building. But they make no architectural sense whatsoever. There's like half a window, etc. So it's a rather chameleon-like piece. The reason for that lump at the bottom, in the factory, once the mould had been semi-reinforced, we took a forklift truck and we pushed the bottom and crumpled it, rather like crumpling the aeroplane, and then cast it broken up, because we weren't allowed to have the sculpture touch the pavement. We had to leave an area for the public to be able to go around the corner. So the mould was broken. I could have cut it off, I could have peeled it back. I had to think many different ideas out, how to get rid of, or how to open up that area on the pavement. And the best way was just push it up, break it. And so that was the piece. And you can see, it's called Square the Block, and it's completely changed the footprint of that location. It's a chameleon. It's like all the other architectural skins in that street, all different types of architectural facades. This is a skin acting like a chameleon that's sitting on that building, and it's completely changed the way you read the formalness of the building. You can see that gap running up. You can see like half a piece of that stonework that's been taken from inside the industry. And again, this is Folkestone. This is a town on the south coast that was dying. It used to be a ferry port. No one goes there. It's only a place to go through to get to France. The ferries now stopped running. And one particular person, a very wealthy man, wanted to put money into the arts to get a tourist industry going down there, a kind of creative tourist industry. And he put forward the idea of a triennale, not a biennale, a triennale. Once every 3 years, invite a bunch of artists to come and make something down there. Some artists go down and they don't respond to Folkestone. Some artists do go down and think about the history or the formalness of aspects of the town. I was one of the first artists to be asked in that first year, 2010. And I went down for a couple of days and I walked around to see if there was an idea anywhere. And I was aware of the dilapidation of the town. It was falling down. It wasn't in a healthy state. You know, there wasn't much money there. There was a big drug problem. There was no shipping. There was a small fishing industry. It was dying. And at the back of the esplanade on the promenade was this old, crazy golf course. You know, the little putting game that we play in England. 18 holes is the title of the work. And these little green bits are where you take your ball and you knock into the hole. So that game and that particular structure, that game that was up on the esplanade all dead and covered with weeds and falling apart, I decided to make a sculpture out of it. This was my material. A sculpture, I transform the old, the forlorn, and the run down, basically. And I say something about the newness of the town. So what we did is I cut 18 sections to make 3 beach huts. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sidewalls, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 back and front, and 6 roofs. And we cut them out, and we made 3 beach huts from the game. And they sit with these beach huts all the way along the front. And that's a permanent piece that stands there. And you can see the little bits of pathway, the little bits of round pretend water, and the little bits of metal that were on the game. And each piece has a hole, which is where the putted ball used to go down. So it's taking the old and talking about the future. This was an interesting work. This is going back to 1999. It used to be a very small art centre in the north of England. It was pulled down. Renton Howard Wood Levine Architects designed a new art centre. No gallery. It was a theatre, music, cinema, health spa and 2 bars. Seems to sum up art. And they wanted a sculpture to be either in the building or on the roof. They didn't mind what it was going to be, but they wanted an artwork, I suppose because it was an art centre. And I spoke to the architects and said, can I use the building as an artwork? What I'd like to do is, if it's about a performing centre where performance takes place, theatre, film, etc., why don't we have a building that performs? So we designed and built an 8-metre bearing, a wheel, and when they made the structure, when they made the building, they put the building also in the bearing. So the building turns backwards and forwards. I think it's 300 degrees, 290 degrees, 300 degrees. So it's that, and then it turns this way. So the opaque becomes transparent. The wall goes round and the glass comes up. The glass goes back and the wall comes down. So you could see out, see in. It's moving very slowly, but it's a flag to say this is a performing arts centre. And that followed on to another piece of work. I had the idea for this piece of work 9 years before it ever got made. I didn't have the money to build it. I didn't have the building, but I needed to find a derelict space in which one could do this particular work. Now, this is a space in Liverpool, and 2008, this was the European capital of culture, this city of Liverpool. And I went and saw the director of the Liverpool Biennale, and I said, I've got an idea for you. I've got all the models and drawings and a bit of the engineering sorted. What I want to do is, rather like Over Easy, the previous piece, I want to take a section of the building, a derelict building, and turn it. Now, what happened with the previous piece, if I just jump back, with this piece, obviously there's lots of maquettes made. You make the maquette to test the idea, to see if it's all right. You make the maquette to show the engineers, so that they can say, yeah, this might work, but that's wrong. And unlike working on a computer, it's very difficult with computers, because people get in the zone and they don't let you touch. Whereas with a maquette, you can put it on the table and everyone can touch it. So the engineers are cutting, drawing, putting marks onto it to try and help me to get to my conclusion. The other thing I make maquettes for, because if I've got to go and talk to a council or a city authority, I can go in and I can unpack this box and say, this is what we want to do. You know, we want planning permission. It's going to look like this. It's going to be this big. There's a person. Gives you a sense of the scale. So maquettes are made for many different reasons. I was making a maquette one night to demonstrate to the engineers the next day how something should work. And on that wheel, I stuck the spindle, but it fell over in the night and stuck like this. So when you turn it, it wobbled. It went backwards and forwards. And this gave me a fantastic idea. As I say, it took 9 years before we realised it. So this is the Yates' Wine Lodge. It's forlorn, it's ugly, it's written off, it's an eyesore. Liverpool want to get rid of it. But I was taking it as an artist, as a sculptor, and saying, I can make the world look at this building. So what we did, we took the facade out, which was a great section, we cut the floors away, and we installed a massive spindle, that's 600 millimetres, 25 mil thick. This is idle rollers, and at the back here, this is the motor that spins 26 tonne of building. It was actually double that, but we had to cut the stone in half to make it so that the weight wouldn't bend the spindle. And so we made a coat hanger to put the building back on. And this is the gap between the static building and the building that... so just got a film here. Oh, it's not on it. How can we get to the film? Do we know how to... There's one on the screen. I don't know how to. There's one down here. Okay, yeah. Just you click on that. This will give you an idea of what took place. So this is the midsummer of 2007. We were asked to put it on because we wanted to put the word Liverpool into the national psyche. A bit stretched, it's actually. There's a 26-ton rotating all day. It would switch on at dawn, the sun would hit a sensor, click on, and it would run until the darkness switched it off. Rather like lighting outside, works in the opposite way. It had a wind sensor, so if it's too windy, it would close off and finish. And it's 3 floors of a 5-floor building, just turning round and round. So all it's doing is turning. Idea, but it was great because crowds would form outside on Moorgate, which is the name of the street, and people were doing selfies, and bands were making films in front of it, and they actually started to bring people inside the building, which was never intended, to witness how it looked inside. It was only supposed to be there for 2008, but it ran right the way through till 2012. When the warranties ran out on the building, we had to hand back to the local authority the licence for the building. But this is something that I want to make again, and we're talking to developers for new builds. Yeah, you can turn it off there. Oh. Yeah, that's it. Keep going. So the piece was called Turning the Place Over. This is what Americans do with eggs. But basically, turning the place over was hinting at turning the rules on their head, turning architectural rules on their head, taking something, like I said, that was written off the lawn. No one wants to see an eyesore, but as an artist, you have that power to be able to convert a piece of rubbish into something which is a gem. You don't have to always build new. You can appropriate, as I say, the forgotten, the forlorn, the written off, and you can just tweak it slightly to make people look again. It's a very, very simple act, but you've just got to get the right idea. That's the difficult bit. We've lost. I'm not quite sure why that's not working now. Sorry about this. It's not. Oh. Okay, so 2012, our Olympic year in the UK, and certain regions in the UK were declared as being culturally relevant to the Olympics, the Cultural Olympiad. That meant that certain artists were invited to work on a particular site located around the UK, and I think there was something like 8 sites. I was offered Bexhill-on-Sea, which is on the south coast, and I worked with the De La Warr Pavilion, which is a very beautiful Mendelssohn one of the very rare Mendelssohn works or architectural pieces in the UK. And it's this wonderful pavilion, the De La Warr Pavilion, which is an art centre. And a couple of years before doing this piece of work, Anthony Gormley was invited to make a piece on the roof. They have like a roof garden, and he placed some of his figures up there. And I was the second artist to work on the roof. And the late Alan Hayden, the director who unfortunately died during the project, he gave me carte blanche basically, because I said I don't want to work where Anthony has worked. I'd like to choose another site. And I don't know why it's doing that. Sorry, let me just... Oh, I'll have to work from here. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone recognises what's going on here. There is a very famous English film. It's an iconic film. It's an iconic building. Let's put those two things together. The iconic film starring Michael Caine is titled The Italian Job. It's a classic Brit movie. You know, it's a comedy, basically. A comedy of errors. But how I ended up doing this piece of work was that I was looking at the actual architecture in quite a formal way. I was looking at that counterbalanced window that sort of sits out over the entrance. I was looking at the architecture for its edges rather than its planes and rather than its mass. I was looking at, you know, the way Mendelssohn must have drawn that as a line. It was all very intriguing. And I thought, what I want to do is I want to draw attention to the sense of the edge of a building, in the same way as when you look out at sea, you've got the edge between water or land to sea, sea to sky. It's all about where one edge meets another, so the sculpture can play on an edge of the building. So the iconic building became a kind of pedestal for the sculpture. And I thought, what I need to do is I need to put something up there, rather like the coach in the final scene of The Italian Job, that's on the precipice of that cliff, and it's doing this. And that would draw attention. And I kept thinking, what can I put up there? And I thought, why am I trying to invent something? Why don't I make a facsimile of the coach, fill it with hydraulics to allow it to sort of teeter on the edge, and it will therefore work in a way of drawing attention to the building, because it's an unusual thing to do. Coincidentally, being the Olympics, there was a Union Jack on that flagstaff that dressed the pole. The coach is red, white and blue. The Union Jack is red, white and blue. So I suddenly realised this was a flag-waving piece for the nation. We'd take the flag down, we'd have the coach doing this, and it would be a flag-waving situation for our Olympic team, who were trying to go for gold in the same way as these people were going for gold. They were robbing Fiat in Turin. They didn't succeed. I don't know how the sequel ends, but basically it all seemed to sum up, the reasons came together to make it actually work. So this gives you an idea of the building and then the way the piece worked on the building. You can imagine this just slightly rocking in the wind. We had one or two problems with the police because of vehicles slowing down. The kind of things you don't think about when you're making these kind of pieces. We had to obviously go planning permission. But being a temporary structure, it was only up there for 2012, we were able to succeed in getting it passed. And as I say, if I'd found a real coach, I would have used that, but we had to make one. So in a way, that's the sculptural aspect. And then, strangely enough, there was an invitation from the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong, of all places. They had heard about the piece, and the director there, she was very intrigued that the Peninsula should possibly borrow the piece of work a couple of years later, and I flew out there to have a look. I couldn't work out how we were going to get it up there. Somehow they found an enormous crane, and we managed to place it 7 floors up on the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong, over on the Kowloon side, overlooking the water. And it was extraordinary, the number of selfies that people were doing down on the floor up with it. Yeah, it's such a thing. But it's this idea of taking the incongruous, taking the odd things. You know, when you're walking in the street, what stops you and makes you go, wow? It's that sort of idea, finding a wow factor, to try and get people to look at that building in a different way. Okay, so we're getting towards the end. A commission came up in 2012 for the new Heathrow Airport Terminal 2, the Queen's Terminal. They were building a brand new terminal. They pulled down the old Terminal 2 at Heathrow, and because of terrorist rulings, there are certain specifics with design now when building public spaces, where you've got to create, I don't know how the best way of describing them are, but this idea, if there's a hypothetical bomb that goes off, you've got to have some kind of spatial moat between where all the transport arrives and where the terminal actually exists. And so there's this 33.5 metre wide, God knows how long, I think it's about 200 metres long, vast corridor of space. And what they were going to do is they were going to put planting in there. They were going to take trees and put them in and make a huge planted area. They discovered, after coming up with that idea, that there wasn't enough light to sustain the growth. So the idea of the tree went out the window, and they scratched their heads, and someone called Mark Davey, who is the director of Future City, an organisation in London that looks at taking on spaces to put major works in, came up with the idea of why don't you commission an international artist to make a piece of work? Obviously, it's dictated by the size. Many artists were put down, and 5 of us made it to the shortlist. And 2 Americans, 2 English, and 1 Japanese. And I was fortunate in securing the commission. And I gave them my idea. I'd been working on a previous idea, which was, what does a tumbling car look like? Think of, is there one? Hang on. No, okay, yeah. Sorry about this. Yeah, that's okay. The previous concept was like, I was working on an idea for a tumbling car. I'd been doing a series of drawings and maquettes of, like, if you take an object and allow it to tumble, what does that shape look like? If I stand here and I went like that, I've just dislodged a load of air. I've made a shape between there and there. It's that sort of idea. So lots of drawings were done converting that car into an aeroplane. I thought I'd take a stunt plane, and what we would do is we'd basically just sort of, in the computer, throw it. Sounds very easy. 1 year, 3 months of engineering to work out the idea and to do all the engineering for the piece of work. We had 3 years to complete. So there were lots of ideas. You know, I had to talk to them about the size of it. So you make a drawing like this. That's an A400 Airbus. That's the sculpture. And that's 7.5 or 8.5 or 8 1/3 London buses. That's a very simple way of making a drawing to explain to someone who's not versed in the grammar of art or sculpture how big something might look. So there was lots of drawings done like this to eventually end up in the Queen's Terminal with this vast 78 metre long, 77 tonne sculpture. And basically, if you can imagine taking a model aeroplane, and this room is filled with clay, and you just chuck it through, this is hypothetical, it goes through the clay and makes a hole. If you fill that hole with plaster, turn all that clay up on end, fill it with plaster, then when it's hard, take the clay away. That shape is what we made. So we took the aeroplane, we threw it, I think the next film. That, by the way, is the car. We're doing that in Dubai, 2 years' time. So that's a car tumbling. That was the original idea. And then that was transposed into the... Yeah, so this gives you an idea of what we ended up with before we built. Once we had that, we had all the engineering. That gave us everything. And that tells you how it actually looks. Remember, it's not flying. It's an object that's not lost control either. It's been deliberately designed to do that movement. So it's not crashing. it's not flying. You're taking it as a shape, and you're just making that shape move. So it was a brave thing for Heathrow to say, yes, do that inside. The idea wasn't to sort of frighten one's audience. But I think it sort of, in a way, displayed for air travellers a sense of velocity of a movement, the sense of movement anyway. I mean, there are artists that have tried to deal with movement. Duchamp, Nude Descending the Stairs. Boccioni's Bottle. There's plenty of examples. I think even Brancusi has that notion of the many moments put together as a sense of movement in art. It's a very difficult thing to do. And you have to start somewhere. The first thing I did is I started looking at comics. And I got very intrigued by comics about football. You know, the tiger. There'd be a drawing of a guy doing that, and there'd be a white shape with a splat thing and a ball. And it's like, what is that white thing in the comic? What is that trying to say? So I was looking at the sense of movement being demonstrated in a comic, and then I started to progress it and build it up to the point where, as I say, I can't design on a computer, but I have teams of people who can do that for me. What I started doing before I went to the engineers is I had a vat of butter. I made a metal aeroplane, I heated the aeroplane up, and I pushed it into the butter, left it in there, and then I'd pour plaster in. And I'd take out these clumsy, crooked, very badly produced pieces. But they gave a sense of excitement and what I wanted to do. And I think that was the best thing I could do with the engineers. Another thing I did is I put an aeroplane in a hamster ball, a clear hamster ball. And I say, what I want is this. And I just fold it along, and they went, I got it. We know exactly what you want to do. It's that kind of invention of what is the most simplest but the best way of trying to describe what it is you want to make. And sometimes the voice isn't the best thing, you know, because you get all excited, you don't know what you're saying, it can be misconstrued. But when you can see a very simple thing like a casting in butter as plaster, or a hamster ball moving along, it forms itself very, very easily for them to then take over. Yeah. So as I say, this is the one of the final slides. This is at night time before the terminal opens. And as I say, it's between the terminal itself here, and this is all the transportation arrival in London. This is buses, coaches, cars, and the underground. And people come in, and what is so beautiful is they have to travel up that escalator, rather like takeoff. You come up and you go through the clouds, and you come above the sculpture. It's a very, very beautiful moment, actually, before you can then enter into the, as it were, the bridges over into the terminal itself. I think there's one more there. That shows slightly from the other side. This is from the rear. This is where you've got a very abstract form going on. It's the start of the movement. You don't quite know what it is, but it's the way it undulates and tumbles like that film. But at the other end, you've got a very optimistic moment of where the aeroplane evens out, and you can see what it is. It's an aeroplane, albeit generic to the program that's made in the computer. And it takes off optimistically up and away, and then it's stopped. Just finally, I just thought I'd just show you that I don't just make the big pieces. This was a show very recently at Anneli Juda Gallery. I don't know if you can see these two drawings here, but what we did is we scanned the outside of the building, and then, you know, if you want to make a box, a cube in cards, you make what's called a net. And a net is like, how do you cut the box out flat, and you fold it, and you can make a cube. So this is the facade of the building, which was scanned, put into the computer, we got that, we folded it up, and it gave us the information to then build the 6 sides of a box, which are the flat facade. So it's taking the 3D, it's taking the 2D of architecture and making it 3D. So that was one piece. There's another piece through there. Let's just go quite quickly through these. There were lots of little playful things. This is just a piece of furniture cut up, but it's actually a maquette for a much, much bigger piece that was being proposed for Singapore. And what it is, it's just demonstrating a way in which you take an object and you can cut it to, in this sense, it was for a tram that was in Singapore. So one takes these things and manipulates them like the aeroplane that was pulled out. You take an object, you cut it, and you can demonstrate a principle, a sculptural principle, about how you can change that form into another form. This is interesting. This was where I took it's a part of the exhibition. It's where I took a slice through my house, through the corridor to the bathroom. So it's like, if you imagine cutting, like the ship, you just cut a whole... If I had two lasers and I went round here, it would follow the topology of the wall and floor. Can you imagine taking that section out and making it solid? That's what that was. That's a section of the house. What that hollow bit is there is where the banisters of the staircase run up. And that was actually reworked for a recent exhibition in Milan. So I remade that piece. I wasn't quite happy with it. Yeah, and these are other sort of playful things. This was next one. This was a drum kit I bought just to cut up, to take the cylinders, to transform them. Next. And the next. And you can see all these demonstrated through drawing as well. Again, this is the staircase before you go through the door into the Anneli Juda Gallery in Dering Street. So the very space you walk through to get to the gallery, when you get to the gallery, you're looking at the space you've moved through. So they're little kind of spatial conundrums, little plays on trying to play with sculpture, trying to play with space, trying to make space solid. I think that's the last one, isn't it? Oh yeah, and there was this is a classic example of drawings in maquette. You've seen a couple of them. But this is, again, lots of these things were made. I've still got stuff wrapped up, but, these are sort of sections of the facade demonstrating that turn in the place over. This is the slice of the ship. I've made a couple of these things to demonstrate, to try and get money, to explain to the engineers where we need to cut, where we need to put steel into reinforce. I don't know if you can see that drawing there. That's a proposal for housing. Take a ship, cut it up into 8 bits or 10 bits, and put it into a street, glaze it, put glass panels in, front and back, to seal out the weather. So they're kind of playful proposals, and every now and again something falls on someone's table, and we go. I think that was the last one. Yeah. No, that's all done. Thank you. I don't know if I've overrun.